All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our fifth webinar, which is Staying Calm Under Pressure, Dealing with Difficult Situations at Work. We're going to be talking about conflict and how we can manage it in the best ways. And I know some people are still joining us, but I'm going to go ahead and get started. So welcome, my name is Marissa Frieder. I'm the Senior Program Manager for Workwell NYC. And we're so fortunate today to be joined by Seydou Nair and Hallie Analytic, both of who work at the city's own Center for Creative Conflict Resolution, which is based at OATH, the Office of Administrative Trials and Hearings, which is one of our fellow city agencies. And before I turn it over to Seydou and Hallie, I just want to share a little bit about Workwell NYC and who we are if you are new. So we are the city's worksite wellness program, and we are here to help you live well and work well. Our goal is to create workplaces that make it easier for employees to live healthy and active lives. And we know that health is it's physical, it's mental, it's financial, it's emotional, and it exists on a spectrum. And so we aim to be here for you all with health and well-being resources and programs and support to help you move more and eat well and be well and take action to prevent disease, no matter where you are on your health journey. And so we have offered several webinars throughout the year, and I just want to flag two upcoming ones. May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and we know that money can be a big stressor, and so our new Project XYZ initiative, which is geared towards younger employees, will be hosting a webinar in 2 weeks on the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, which is a loan forgiveness program that city employees are eligible for. It's a great resource to help you lessen your debt, so stay tuned for that webinar coming up. And then we're going to be wrapping up this Be Well webinar series in June with a presentation on resilience and how we can build resilience and use it to be mentally and physically and emotionally well. But today we're here to talk about something else that impacts our mental health, and that's conflict with others. And so we're so excited to have Seydou and Hallie here from the Creative Conflict Resolution Center. They work with agencies across the city to help employees resolve conflict, improve their communication, and build positive working relationships. And today they're going to share with us a few ways to manage conflict at work. So I'm going to turn it over to Hallie. Thank you.
Great, thanks Marissa. So we're going to start just talking about a definition of conflict, or kind of like a working definition of when we think about conflict in the workplace, what are helpful things to remember. So one way to think about conflict is that it's a function of relationships, and we are in relationship with each other, whether we like it or not, when we're in the workplace. So conflict is what happens when there's disharmony in how we relate to one another. And disharmony doesn't exactly mean disagreement. You know, we can disagree with people about a lot of things. Where it becomes disharmonious is when it's impacting our goals, our values, our interests, and that is what's at stake when we're in conflict, and so when conflict comes up. So that's one way that we think of conflict at the center. Another helpful definition is to think of conflict as experienced on these different levels. So we wrote down as perception, as emotion, or as behaviors. So as perception, the way that we think about it is that for conflict, I only have to perceive that I'm in conflict with Seydou for me to be in conflict with Seydou. You know, she doesn't have to sign off or feel the same way. It's my perception that something that she's doing or the way that we're relating to each other is disharmonious or is preventing me from getting my interest or need. We often do mediations at the center, and what we hear is, you know, when we are talking to two people in conflict, one person says there's a conflict and the other person says that there isn't. So that goes to people's perceptions of conflict. You can also think of conflict as being experienced on this emotional level. So it's not so much about perception, but I know I'm in conflict when I feel that I'm in conflict, when I have emotions that, you know, are unpleasant, but are human, about being angry or sad or feeling guarded, fear, hurt, pain, on that emotional level is the way conflict can be experienced. And then lastly, kind of the most obvious, but not always maybe the most common, is when conflict is experienced on a behavioral level. That there is an action that is clear to me that someone's taking against me, or that I'm taking against someone, that demonstrates that we're in conflict. This could be physical, which is the most obvious, but also verbal or written by email. And those are the indicators that we're experiencing conflict on this behavioral level. And so, thinking about conflict at the workplace, why are we spending time on this webinar talking about it, is that, if conflict is a function of relationships, then we're in relationships with a lot of people, and that includes people that we are at work with, so that it's natural that conflict follows us to work. There was a study that was done in 2000, this is one study that was done in 2008. There's a ton of studies out there that surveyed 5,000 employees in 9 different countries to talk about conflict in the workplace. And they found that 85% of employees experience conflict on the job. And that when they asked them, how much time was spent, that approximately 2.8 hours per week was spent dealing with conflict. So it's prevalent, and it takes time out of our days or weeks or months to manage conflict in the workplace. And what the study also found is common sources of workplace conflict, which shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, is workload and stress. And I know that there was a webinar that Marissa did recently about stress management, and one of the common sources of stress was workload. So this kind of reinforces what we know. This last part, that the study also found that the more training there is around conflict management, the more likely there is to be positive outcomes that come from conflict. It doesn't mean that sitting in a webinar or having training eliminates conflict, and we'll get to that in a minute, but it's more about that it can be managed well, and that positive outcomes can come from it. So another way to think about it, since this is a wellness series, is that conflict impacts our personal wellness. We're talking about in the workplace, but all of this could be applied outside of the workplace too. It impacts our relationships with people, ending them sometimes, having a fractured relationship. Conflict and stress have like a symbiotic relationship, where conflict causes stress and stress causes conflict. And so there's ways that shows up in our physical body with headaches and stomach pain, mental anguish, confusion, being disoriented, and emotionally, right? Stress impacts us on the emotional level. Thinking about like outside of ourselves, that it also impacts the way that we can do our work. So oftentimes when there's conflict in the workplace, it might lead to a loss of interest in the work that you're doing, or your own motivation in the work that you're doing, kind of taking the focus off of the work product. And there's this porous boundary between conflict that happens at work that sometimes we take home to our families and to our partners and to our friends, and then vice versa, conflict that we have with our family, our partner, our friends, we also take it to work. So it's not so easy, to leave it behind. There's a quote that's attributed to Buddha that says, holding on to anger is just like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Intense, but I think that this is something that a lot of people in conflict can relate to, that when we hold on to it, it really impacts our personal wellness in that really felt way. You can also think about conflict and wellness in terms of an agency's or an organizational wellness perspective. A lot of times conflict is talked about in, conflict, time spent managing conflict equals, the dollars and cents that an agency that impacts an agency's bottom line, but there's also thinking about just agency wellness, overall wellness. Conflict can lead to like wasting time because the time is spent managing conflict rather than whatever the work product is. It results in lower motivation with employees, which can lead to lower morale or insufficient work product when we're not really motivated to do what we need to do for our jobs. Increased turnover, so people leaving, which sometimes takes that institutional knowledge with them. And then when there's a lot of turnover, it also impacts the people that are staying in the workplace with that morale and motivation and fractured relationships. In terms of wellness, it can also lead to inefficient workflows. So, these are all more than just a financial impact. And this workflow, oftentimes we see the ways that agencies deal with conflict could be moving people or transferring people or having people report to different supervisors, which might lead to, the workflow not being carried out in the way that was intended. So this is kind of an overall why we care about it and why we wanted to spend some time talking about it today. We wanted to get into next kind of thinking about conflict. The way that we think about it is the what and the how of conflict. So we're going to ask you to think of one conflict. I'm sure there's many, but just one conflict that you've been in your life. Take a few seconds to reflect and to bring that up in your mind. You're not sharing this conflict. And then once you have it, if you could write in the chat box that comes up next to your screen, what is the first word that comes to mind when you think of that conflict or when you think of being in that conflict? So if you could start writing that in the chat box, and we're going to take a few seconds to compile them to see, what's coming up for you guys when you think of a conflict that you've been in.
Are they coming in?
So we'll take one more minute for you to write in the first word that comes to mind when you think of the conflict. So we compiled a few from the words that have come in. And so what we have are anger, frustration, misunderstanding, feeling unseen or unheard, confrontation, unfairness, tired, dishonesty. Great words. Unnecessary, stress, which makes sense that it's up there, misunderstanding, mistake. Great, thank you. So if you are looking at these words, I'm wondering for you, what do they have in common? And I'm asking this rhetorically. I know you can't answer me. So I'll just tell you that, the one thing that they have in common is that they are all pretty negative, also sometimes emotional, but with the negative, that's what we like to draw out with this exercise. We didn't ask you to think of a conflict that you've been in and what's negative about it. We just asked to think of a conflict that you've been in. And oftentimes what comes up, we've done this exercise a lot, are these negative words. We've done the exercise a lot across a range of people and a range of ages, as young as when we were doing trainings in schools, as young as people in 3rd grade. So, to me, what this tells us about conflict is that it's a negative experience, right? That might be like a no-brainer, but it's important to stop and think about that it's negative for usually both people that are involved, even if they're different, felt in different ways. And that, even for me with training, it doesn't make conflict less negative. So what it does, though, is help highlight the second point of, is this everything? are these experiences of feeling unseen and unheard and confrontation and mistake and stress, is that all conflict is? Like, is that all that there is? So I'm going to ask you to do that same exercise where you think of a conflict, either the same one that you thought of or a different one, and think about if there's been a positive that's come out of conflict for you. And do that same thing where you write a word or two in the chat box of a positive that's come out of conflict. And so we'll take a minute to do that and to see the words that are coming in. So good, thank you. Seeing some good words coming up. So we'll compile a few of them. So what we have, as they're coming in, I'll read a few of them. Growth and resolution, tolerance, satisfaction. Sometimes it leads to better relationships. We'll wait for a few more to come in. Great, so let's see what else is here. Cool. So relief, neutral, stability, a learning experience, an opportunity, teaching us something about self-awareness and perspective, growth, quiet, thank you, empathy. So this is great, creativity, all great things, thank you. And so, you know, the way that this activity kind of plays out, obviously, is that conflict, there's a dual nature to conflict, right? There's the destructive parts that we spoke about, you know, stress and mistake and misunderstanding and feeling like it's pointless, but then there's also the constructive potentials that are present in conflict, where there is a chance for some quiet and some relief and some empathy, maybe even learning something. And so this is important to know that while the first thing that might come up for us, and Seidu is going to talk a little bit more about why that is, the first thing that comes up for us might be a negative experience. There's also this potential for positives. And so something that I like is I did a mediation training not recently, but in my past with a rabbi who said that conflict is likened to water in the Bible. So if there's too much water in the world, you know, there's flood and destruction and death. And then if there's not enough water in the world, there's famine and destruction, and there's no growth. So, you know, part of this first takeaway is that we aren't saying that we want no conflict. We want conflict. We want to figure out ways to be in better relationship and to have a creative experience and to grow. And so the thought is, what do we do, right? Like, is this a way that when we think of the constructive and the destructive potentials of conflict, can we then think about what actions follow? And are we taking actions that will maximize or leverage the potential positives in conflict, or will they keep us in this negative experience of conflict? So this thought of, can we have bifocal vision of the constructive parts of conflict and also the destructive parts of conflict? We're going to play with this concept of bifocal vision again, with this concept of, on the next slide, of the how and the what. So that was kind of alluded to in the beginning. The way that we can think of bifocal vision of the constructive and the destructive, you know, factors of conflict, but we can also think of bifocal vision as there's the what of conflict, you know, what we are in conflict about. And we'd like to hear a little bit from you in a poll in a minute about what you're in conflict about in the workplace. What we don't pay a lot of attention to, though, is how do we go about engaging in that conflict. And so that's what we're going to spend some time talking about today. You know, are the hows that we're taking leveraging the positives in conflict, or are they keeping us in the negatives in conflict? And so can we have some choice in picking a how, if we'd like, that will keep us in the positives in conflict. Before getting into the what's, we're going to pause for a minute and do a poll that Marissa's going to lead for what types of conflict come up in your agencies.
Thank you, Hallie. So you should see a question on your screen now asking you what types of conflict have you experienced at work. Some of the common ones are the old guard versus the new guard, or cultural differences. So if you could just take a minute to answer the question that's on your screen, you can check as many as you have personally experienced, and we will share the results out in just a minute. All right, so a lot of people have experienced micromanagement or not getting enough guidance in work as a source of conflict. We're also seeing personality and cultural differences, but it seems like all of these, more than half of you have said you've experienced at one time or another, which goes to show how common conflict is and how important it is to figure out how we make it a positive experience. I'm going to turn it back over to Hallie to keep walking us through that.
Thanks, Marissa. So yes, that kind of, that poll makes a lot of sense. And so when we think of the what of conflict, that's kind of what we were getting at with that question, that there is, the way that we think about it is the what is the substance of conflict. That's what is coming up with the old guard and the new guard, or with unequal assignments, with deadlines, with being micromanaged or not having enough guidance. We spend a lot of time thinking about the what, right? Because that is what is keeping us in disharmony. It's what's preventing us from meeting our interests or our goals. We think about it to ourselves, we talk about it with our friends. This is the stuff that we take home. And it makes sense that we think about the what often. And what we want to flip to, kind of, can we have a bifocal vision? Can we keep our focus on the how as well? And so that's what we want to spend some time talking about now, is the how of conflict. So kind of regardless of what the what is, what that type of conflict is that's coming up in your workplace, there's also the question of how are we engaging on the what? So what are the ways that we are engaging in conflict? And this is where hopefully we can have some choice on how we engage in conflict. So these are just some examples. We can, a lot of training is thinking, can we build muscles on hows? Like, can we figure out new hows that will maximize the positives in conflict and keep us out of the negatives? So this is just a few of them that we're kind of going to run through, but each of them could be a webinar in themselves. So this first thought is, how are we talking about the what? Are they blaming statements? So putting the onus on what the person is doing wrong. The example I wrote down is, you're always late on assignments, right? Or are they I statements? I statements are craft, but it is when you, instead of focusing on what the person's doing wrong, the focus shifts onto yourself and the impact that that action has on you. And that's the part sometimes that we don't share, but that is why it's so frustrating to us, right? So I'm frustrated because when I receive assignments after the deadline, it pushes back my own timetable and I'm late on things. So can you tell me what's leading to the assignments being turned in late, if that's the question you want to ask? Or I need you to turn it in on time. What's stopping you from doing that? Like, you can get more creative with the question, but the first part is, can we put the action, the impact that the action has on us? And that's a good how to keep us in the positives, because we're reflecting on, well, why is this important to me? Another way to think about it, not so much in what you say, but what you ask. So are we making assumptions about why people are acting or doing what they're doing, or are we asking questions? So you can even get more nuanced into what type of questions are we asking when we're in conflict. A closed question is something that you have a yes or no answer to, or a short answer. So with this same hypo, did you finish the assignment on time? yes, no, it's closed, it might be important to know. But if we wanted to try and have a difficult conversation with someone, if we wanted to figure out a way to get ourselves out of this conflict, it would be, can we think of a more open question? Why haven't you finished the assignment on time? The open questions are usually the questions we don't know the answer to, where we're trying to get more information from the person that we're speaking with. And then kind of broadly, when we think about our hows, how much time are we spent listening to people? You know, this is a how in itself that we spend a lot of time in trainings about, you know, how do we listen effectively? It's not something that we're necessarily taught. So can we think about, when we think about hows, can we think about listening as a how? And then, you know, there's the hows in what we say, but then there's all those hows in what we don't say. So I'm sure that you've heard this somewhere before, right? But it's that like old maxim, it's not what you say, but it's how you say it, right? Because only like 7% of our messages are communicated through the words that we use. That rest of that big chunk of 90% is communicated through our paraverbals or our nonverbal body language. So thinking about, when we think about the how, can we also think about, well, what are the things that we're not saying and how is that contributing to our how? So tone is huge. You know, are we dismissive in our tone or are we inquisitive and open? You know, our pitch, are we speaking really loudly that doesn't really leave any space for someone to come in, or are we more calm and more slow? Our speed and also silence, like are we leaving space for people to fill the silence that's not just us? And then nonverbals with body language, with posture, with eye contact, which comes up a lot. You know, we spend a lot of times with computers, so how often are we typing on a computer when we're trying to have a difficult conversation with people? What kind of message is that giving off, regardless of what the message is? Our body language, our shoulders, our arms crossed, is one person standing while the other person's sitting? We can, you know, go into this for a long time, but we're not going to. It's more just to note about, you know, that these are ways that our message is carried. So on that note, I'm going to switch it to Sadhu to talk about why it's so difficult to choose hows.
Hi, everyone. This is Sadhu. Please excuse me. I have a little sore throat, so I hope you can hear me well. So we wanted to just jump into what it is that happens to us as individuals in our bodies and our brains when we are in conflict, so that we can understand, like, and then figure out how to move through and make different choices. Excuse me. Neuroscience is great because it offers us a lot of insights into what it is that's happening in our brains and our bodies. And to put it simply, I'll just refer to 4 parts of our brains that each have a function that stands on its own, but at the same time work together to keep us going and keep us moving in life. The 4, you might have heard of this before, but the 4 parts of our brain that I'll refer to today is the reptilian brain, the mammalian brain, the neocortex, and the prefrontal cortex. If you look at what we have here, we've parsed it out as the lower mind and the higher mind, and I'll get into that in 1 second. The reptilian brain is usually our survival brain, like the go-to brain. It's the most basic. It's literally the brain that we had way before we evolved into this current state of human being. And its sole function is to make sure that we're alive. So the only question that that part of our brain asks is, am I safe? Can I stay alive? And there's a particular part of the brain, there are 2 almond-shaped masses called the amygdala. And what happens with the function of the amygdala is really great because it helps us stay alive. So if you're walking down the street and a bus is coming at you, the amygdala goes on activation. It activates, and then it says, like, you know, jump, run, save yourself. And so it's a very, very important part of the brain, but it's also the part of the brain that gets most activated when we're in conflict, whether it's a small conflict or a big conflict. The amygdala often doesn't know the difference because it's just trying to save us from ourselves sometimes. The next brain is the feeling brain or the mammalian brain. And this brain is, this part of our brain is a little bit more complex because what it does, it helps us be with our emotion. It gives us a sense, it helps us experience our emotions, basically. A lot of times when we're in conflict, there's a lot of emotional flooding. So that's the mammalian brain when it's overly active. And the reason that we put the reptilian and the mammalian brain together in the lower mind category is because even this emotional flooding, what it can do is it keeps our brains from being operating at our rational and other bests. So the function of the mammalian brain is to process the emotion and the question that it fundamentally asks is, am I seen in what's happening to me? The next one that I referred to, now switching into the higher mind, you know, the two categories, the lower and the higher. This one is the first in the higher mind section, and it's called the neocortex. And its basic function is to make sure that we're thinking rationally, and then you know, like that's the analytic brain. We all have all of these parts of the brain. And so this, you probably will recognize, was what happens when you're, you know, more or less physically comfortable, emotionally you're doing okay, and then you can start to reason and ask questions like, can I make sense of this? Or, you know, what is happening here? So that brain is very useful, and that's also how, when we're in this part of the brain is when we're beyond this fight and flight. I think I failed to mention in the earlier part, when we're in the reptilian and mammalian brain, we're in that fight flight. So something's coming up and we're like, run or hide or get away from here so we can protect ourselves. So this is the beginning of leaving that state. The next one we have is the prefrontal cortex, which is we're calling the big picture brain. So when we're really good, and a lot of times we can only activate this part of our brain when we're at ease, when we're not impacted by things that are happening around us. And it's really great. And everybody has this capacity that it's our insightful and perspective taking brain. It doesn't, so when we say perspective taking, we also mean that it's not giving up our perspective. It's just holding our perspective while holding another perspective at the same time. We all do this all the time. This is the part of our brain that is really good at collaborating with other people. Typically, there's a lot of data and probably life experience that proves that this part of the brain isn't fully developed until your mid-20s. And so for people with children, this is why it's so hard to have teenagers. But just going back to the picture brain, the question it's asking is there something that I'm not seeing here? What else is there? And I know that we've all asked these kinds of questions in difficult situations. Now, the reason that we highlight the various parts of the brain is because a lot of times in conflict, when we're hijacked, you know, when that amygdala is hijacked, what we tend to do is we react. And again, it's a very good thing to react because reacting keeps you alive at certain moments. But when we're in conflict and we want to move through that moment, move past that reactive moment, we have to figure out how to respond rather than react. And so we'll get into actual tools and ways on how to respond and react. And I'm just pausing for a second just to get my head together. The reason we want to focus on responding is because that's when we can, you know, Hallie was mentioning earlier the what and the how. So we want to get to how to do, you know, what are the hows. And in order to get to that, we have to be in that responsive part of the brain. And then we can figure out like what is the most appropriate response in any given conflict. So before we get into that a little bit more, I'm going to ask Marissa to lead us in another poll.
Sure, thank you, Sadhu. So our next poll is going to help us kind of identify how we react. So you will see it on your screen momentarily, but the question is, the last time you were in a difficult situation, like, how did you react? And so there are several answers. You can, you know, choose whatever resonates with you. But a lot of these are functions of kind of that initial reaction that we all will have. So I'm just going to give it one more second for people to get their responses in. Okay. So a lot of people are noting increased heart rate, clenching of your jaw or tension in your muscles, raised body temperature, all of these things are reactions. And I know now I'm going to turn it back over to Sejal, who's going to tell us how we can kind of manage those and, get to a more productive place.
This is great. Thanks for your participation. This is very normal, and there are also other things that happen to us in our bodies, but this is really, the key to shifting from the reaction to the response place is to really just get a sense of what's happening in your body, because that's where we have information. Like our emotions and our feelings give us information. And so the first step in getting into that higher mind, getting into that prefrontal cortex where you can make bigger decisions and ask better questions, is to slow down. So when your heart is racing, when you become aware of that, breathing is a great way to reduce heart rate. Like, this isn't rocket science here that I'm sharing with you, but it's important, because in those moments when we're impacted, it's hard to do this. But we can practice, build practices of living better. And so one of the first things to do is to just slow down and become aware of your breath. Just breathe more consciously. Becoming aware of your breath is a little different from breathing consciously. So actual conscious breathing can help us slow that heart rate. It actually decreases the body temperature. Drinking water is a really, really great tool. A lot of times we forget this. Taking a walk, literally walking away from the moment or the situation or the space. And then a very, very good thing to do is also talking to somebody who is a friend or a coworker or somebody you can call, just because it helps us get out of that moment. So slowing down is the first real step. After that, you really want to, we're thinking about, again, now how to respond and how to get into that higher mind. So what you want to do is check in with yourself. So once your body is sort of regulated, then you can access your emotions. Then you can slow down and think about, like, what is it that's happening to me? So we're like identifying feelings is one of those things. So what am I feeling? I'm feeling anger. I'm feeling frustrated. I'm feeling angry and sad, many feelings, disconnected, shocked, burnt out. So what we can only do this, identify these things, when we are outside of that immediate moment of reaction. So you slow down, then you check in with yourself and figure out what those emotions are. We wrote those words, sad, mad, happy. There's more than this, just because we do. I think there's a discrepancy between how we actually feel on a day-to-day basis and what we think that we feel. So typically we tend to categorize it very quickly into I'm mad, I'm sad, I'm happy. But really a whole lot of other stuff is going on for us. Disconnected, dejected, rejected, like lots and lots of experiences. So you really want to get to identifying what the emotion is that you're feeling, because again, emotions have a lot of information for us to then work with. And once you've identified your emotion, various emotions, then you can figure out, what is it about this that really matters to me? Now, this is when we really shift into the higher mind, and then we work with the conflict. So something is happening. Now I know what I'm feeling. What matters to me about this? So we wrote these words, my positions, my needs, and my values, as a way of helping us get a deeper understanding of this conflict and what matters about it, why it impacts us so much. So we're going to shift to another slide that is just a quick example of breaking that down, just figuring out what's happening. So let's say you're in the workplace and you feel like people have been avoiding you, or you're not being invited. This is a common experience in the workplace where somebody feels isolated. So the feeling is that you might sit and feel dejected and feel sad. And you're feeling sad because you're not being invited to or included in social activities, for example. So what you want to do is, once you identify okay, I'm sad, this is what's happening, and I'm sad. And so you want to break open the sad a little bit more and really understand what is it's going on for you. So all of us have these needs, to feel connected to one another. So when you're not being included in social activities, or you feel like you're not being included in social activities, that you start to feel disconnected, and you might start to feel rejected, and you might actually feel isolated or isolate yourself. And so those are the real, like, more messy feelings that are there underneath that sadness. And then again, we're saying emotions are very useful because they give us information about what's really happening. So how do we get from our needs to like, what is it underlying those needs that's really shaping maybe my own behavior? So for example, if I'm feeling disconnected and isolated, I actually further isolate myself. That's just my personal tendency. And so what are the ways to sort of shift into that is to begin to identify what is happening within me. What are the values that this is really touching upon? So I need belonging, I need connection, and I need to be recognized. I need to become a part. And so these are the real needs that are underneath the feelings that then sometimes turn into behavior. Like in my example, if I'm further isolating myself, I'm doing that because really I'm looking for belonging, connection, and I can't find a way to get to that. So taking action. So the first one was to slow down. The second step was to check in with yourself and figure out what's going on underneath that conflict or that experience. And then the third is taking action. And taking action, what we mean by taking action is you want to, referring back to what Hallie was saying about the hows, you want to figure out pick a how. You want to pick a how of responding, right? So in a way that, like we were saying earlier, leverages what's positive about the conflict. And it also meets your needs. So if my need is to belong, then I want to figure out how to have belonging in a positive way. So yeah, I can continue to sit there and further isolate myself, or maybe I can sign up for a lunch and learn something that's happening in the agency. And it's still that action of mine meets my need, even if maybe I'm not invited to this particular group. So my need to feel belonging and to feel connection in the workplace can be met in other ways. And so that's an example of like choosing a how that takes advantage of what's positive about a conflict and that also meets your needs. Now, this is a very simplistic example that we're giving, but then in different scenarios, there are different things to consider. For example, if the conflict is different, like taking an action, you want to think about timing. Is this the right time for this particular action? It might not be. If I'm, again, feeling dejected and there's a moment when I feel like people are standing in the corner and not including me, and I want to belong, like running into that group and just overly enthusiastically contributing might not be the best moment in time. It might, that itself might be a reaction. You also want to consider your environment. Is this the right place? There are other factors, like you might have a commissioner or a deputy commissioner in the room, and the actual space itself might not be the right place for you to take an action. So these are just things to consider. Who else needs to be involved? Sometimes we're in conflict, and I'm sure a lot of you are already thinking this, like we've been focusing on what you can do for yourself, but sometimes other people need to be involved. And this is, we have measures in place in city government. We have HR offices, EEO offices, places you can go to open up what's going on for you and explore who else needs to be here. Maybe a supervisor needs to be here so that they can help be part of changing something that's happening, that's contributing to the conflict. Is there something, and this is a very important question, the next one, is this something for you to take on? Sometimes because conflict impacts us, we immediately respond and react to it. But sometimes, one thing to consider is that maybe you don't need to take it on, and that there's a way of, you want to figure out, of course, like what are your goals in that before you ask that question, but sometimes it's not for you to do. And then what other resources are available to me? Who else can I ask? What can I do? Do I need other support for myself? And, and we wrote including self because the truth is we are all very capable people and we know what we need. We just need to keep going back to ourselves. So yourself is also a great resource. When we're really confused and lost and feeling disconnected, a lot of times, you have lived your own life in your own body and no one else has. And so you are in many ways your biggest resource.
So this is Hallie again. I'm just going to finish up. Sadie did a lovely job of, helping with some steps to get into our higher mind and not to continue this well-worn path of something happens and then I react in this lower mind way. And so going through these 3 steps of slowing down, checking in with ourselves, and then taking some sort of action that best suits our needs and then maximizes the potential positives in conflict. The thought is only when those that self-awareness is gone through can you really, that neocortex, that perspective taking mind, only when you're fully aware of your own needs and values and goals can you step into the perspective of the other. And so I know we've all heard of empathetic responses and how to practice empathy, and empathy, the way that we think about it, is really a form of taking perspective of the other. And so we wanted to play a clip next of someone that can explain empathy way better than we can. So this is a clip from Brene Brown differentiating empathy from sympathy. And so if you could take a minute, make sure your volume is up to listen to this clip.
Oh, sorry. Sorry about that. Trying it again.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, I'm down. I know what it's like down here. And you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. I had it, yeah. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Great. So thank you. Sorry for the tech difficulties in the beginning. We're going to have some time for questions at the end, and we hope that maybe you include some questions and comments from that video as well. There's so much there. Just one thing to note, and I know we want to leave time for questions, so I'm going to be wrapping up, but one thing with empathy is taking the perspective of the other. And so that's one reason why we have to check in with ourselves first before taking the perspective of the other. And sometimes it's not about saying the right or the best thing, but can you just be present with other people when there are these difficult conversations that are going on. So kind of to wrap up this portion, this is all about, like Michelle Obama, building our muscles. The path to the lower mind is a well-worn path that is always going to be there. We tread it and we tread it often, but can we build muscles to get it to the higher mind? And this webinar is a first step, maybe a step that is many of your steps along a journey of building muscles for how we can have more responses when conflict comes up, because it is going to keep coming up for us. And kind of with the same thought of muscle building, it's also knowing when to ask for help. And so we want to spend just a few minutes talking about the center, because we are available to help with workplace conflict. So Seydou and I work at the Center for Creative Conflict Resolution at Oath, which is a citywide conflict resource center that's committed to helping city employees and agencies resolve and find creative, collaborative, fair, and cost-efficient responses to conflicts. Like we spoke about, through offering a few different services, which I'll talk about next, we are trying to transform the harmful potential or the negatives that are conflict that are present into potential opportunities for improved communication, enhanced relationships, ultimately greater public trust in the work that we're doing, and positive change within agencies. So the center has a few services. You can also find all this information and more at our website, but I'll just run through them. The backbone of the center is a mediation program. So we have workplace mediation for two or three employees that are in conflict coaching, which is a one-on-one intervention and support if you are going through a conflict or you have to prep for a difficult conversation with someone that you work with. We do a lot of work with groups. So if there's a unit or a group or a team, or even sometimes an agency that's experiencing conflict, can we try to figure out creative ways to work with conflict and figure out good hows with people through restorative practices and group facilitations. We also have training, dispute systems design, which is a larger program, and conflict management consultations. So for our services, how they work, a few things. They're free to city agencies and employees, and they're voluntary, meaning you can't take someone to mediation, but it's more of if it would be helpful for a conflict that you're going through. And all of our services are coordinated through referring officers at some of our partnering agencies, which I could talk about next. But the thought is that there's a point person within an agency that knows about the center, knows about how to make referrals, and can assist you in making those referrals. Everything that's done at the center is confidential, so kept between the people that are participating within one of the services. Self-determined outcomes. We at the center aren't the ones that are telling you what to do or what we'd recommend, but really going through processes to see, like Seydou said, your best resources. How can we help people come up with ways that make sense for them, and that it's on paid work time, which is important because conflict is part of work. And I think the last part is just that these are some of our partners. So if you see your agency up here, then there's a referring officer. If you don't see your agency up here, then you could always contact us directly, and we can give you information on how to use the center. Again, I would check out our website, but you can email us, give us a call. We'd be happy to tell you how you can access our services and also just give you more information about any of those services. That's all that we have. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you, Marissa and Victoria, for facilitating this for us.
Thank you so much, Hallie and Seju. We have just a couple of minutes left for some questions. But so you can type those into the chat box on your screen. But also I just want to flag, we will send out these slides. We can send out the link to the Oath Creative Conflict Resolution Center, so you can see more information there. And we also will be sending out a brief survey, hoping to get some feedback from you on today's presentation. There's a link URL on your screen if you want to type that into your browser. We will also be sending it out in a follow-up email along with the slides and everything I just mentioned. So let's see what questions are coming in. Someone is asking if the center comes to the workplace to give workshops, or is it like you and your team comes to the center?
Yeah, so that is a great question, and it kind of depends. For trainings, there is flexibility in traveling, training or workshops like you mentioned, especially if you have good space, then we're really happy to come there. For the other services like mediation or coaching or group work, where we want to really have a private space, we ask for employees to come to us. And we're located on 66 John Street, which is in the financial district.
Great. Someone is asking, how do you begin to resolve interpersonal conflicts that have been years in the making?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And a lot of conflicts, especially in the workplace, tend to be conflicts that are years in the making. Really, the first step is becoming self-aware and also preparing yourself to step into that conflict. So the conflict coaching sessions that we offer are a really great first step if you know that you need to address it and you don't know how and you need some support on an individual level, whether you are ready to have a difficult conversation or whether you just want to get a sense of what's happening for you when you're in that conflict and how you want to sort of go about it. We also have consultations for people who are in leadership positions who are managing conflicts in the group, in their teams and their departments. So you can call us for a consultation and we'll listen to what your situation is and figure out what are the best number of steps to take. I'll just pause there.
Great, and I know I want to be mindful that it's almost 1 o'clock, so we'll just do one final question, which is, someone was saying, are there times where a conflict just can't be fully resolved, and how do you accept that or move on from that situation?
Yeah, that's a great question, because there are a lot of conflicts that you can't always resolve and tie up really perfectly, and a lot of that is coming to terms with that. For example, a breakup is a really great example of a conflict that is a real conflict that you experience, but that can't necessarily be resolved always in the ways that we intend, right? So then you want to think about what have I learned from this, or what is most important from this experience that I want to take away, and then also, how do I close? That's just one life experience that I think everybody has with conflict, but really, there are ways to pull what is most valuable for you, and then also think about, if this happens again, how do I want to respond next time based on what happened here? So again, conflict coaching sessions, talking to people in your life, especially people you've known for a very long time, is really great because they can give you perspective when in a moment that you yourself don't have it.
All right. Well, thank you so much. If there are other questions, you can reach out to our Workable NYC email, and we'll get them over to Hallie and Seju. You can email them directly at the Mediation Center email, which we will recirculate. And we hope that this was helpful and hope that you have a great rest of the afternoon. So thank you so much.